Well, that's a pretty dynamic show to follow. So I'm going to talk pretty simple. A simple story, a simple tale of two figures. You've got the rectangle and the triangle. That's what we're talking about today. But it's a tale of quality concepts. So you have the triangle or the pyramid versus the rectangle. So in that, when we talk about athlete development frameworks or athlete development models, in the 60s, there was a lot of triangles or pyramids. And when we introduced Sport for Life and long-term athlete development, we introduced the rectangle. So the purpose of my keynote this morning is to, one, see if you're triangles or whether you're rectangles. And if you're rectangles, that you can go out and be champions of being rectangles. So what is the old model of athlete development? The model that was developed, you saw a lot of these around the 60s in athlete development models. And basically, as you can see, it's to take a whole bunch of participants at the beginning, at the community level, systematically get rid of them so that you've got one or two left on your Olympic team. That's the triangle or the pyramid. It's systematic exclusion. That's the pyramid. When we talk about the rectangle, we talk about getting everyone involved, which the pyramid is trying to do as well. But then as they go on their journey, their physical literacy journey, or their journey in terms of development as athletes, wherever they are, they're included and they're honored in that inclusion. So, again, the pyramid, it's a system of exclusion. It's taking a group, systematically getting rid of them, and as opposed to the rectangle. So when we look at that in the concept of short-term, long-term, the pyramid is short-term. It's short-term engagement. It's towards that gold medal, but the gold medal is the end. In that model, in that framework, the gold medal is the end. Either you're out or you win a gold medal. Whereas again, in terms of the rectangle, the gold medal, which we all love gold medals, there's no question about it. It's part of the journey. And so when you've won the gold medal, your life isn't over. Your athletic career is not over. So what are those transitions? When you build a system in the rectangle, when you've got the gold medal, you're still going on to be a 74-year-old athletic individual. So you talked about a couple of your key things in Swedish sport, and one is that the federations align to your values. So this is a clash of values, the pyramid versus the rectangle. A system of exclusion, a system of inclusion. And you mentioned that everyone can participate in Swedish sport. Well, when you look at the pyramid versus the rectangle, in the rectangle, you're sport-centric, and because you're not honoring the individual wherever they're at in their pathway, whether it's a transfer from one sport to another, the pyramid's not designed to do that. And let's, again, when we talk about short-term versus long-term, one of the things that, well, we were discussing last evening about the school system and sport, whether it's in Sweden or whether it's in Canada or whether it's in really any country that has come to the International Physical Literacy Conference, sports want to get into the school system. As Tom says, all the kids are there. So we want to go into the school system, and we want to go in, and if we go in with the concept of the pyramid, it's about getting kids into sport so we can determine who's really good so that we can then get rid of them and maybe find a couple of gems. Whereas on the rectangle side, we're having them be involved in sport for their lifelong journey of physical literacy. And when we go into schools, we have trouble going into schools. Why? Because many of the teachers in schools have had a poor experience in sport. They've got involved in the pyramid and been excluded. And now they're teachers. And they go, sport, you come to me that we're wonderful, but I'm an elementary school teacher and I had a poor experience and I'm not going to expose my kids to that. Or we have in the pyramid, we have teenagers. One of the things I know, Tom, you're a volleyball player, that I've walked into gyms in Canada where in grade 9, there's over 50 young women trying out for the school volleyball team. And there's one team. So there's 40 girls that are told they're not good enough to participate in sport, because that model of the pyramid is saying, well, we just need one at this level now, we just need one team. So we're going to exclude them. And then 10 years later, they're parents. They're mothers. And they're, well, I'm going to protect my children from that experience because that was a really bad experience. That's short-term thinking versus the rectangle, which is long-term thinking of honoring their journey, being inclusive. Then later, 10 years later, when they have children, they're going to include those children. So again, the short-term versus long-term. So when we look at, again, the triangle, they're linear pathways to either you get to the next level, you make that next team as the participation diminishes, or you're out. But what we see in terms of the journey of kids in sport is that it's all over the place. If we can create the model of being all over the place, where you're developing and then maybe you're dropping off, but you're not excluded, and so then you're ready to come back. You know, your kick in, your adolescent growth spurt kicks in, and your motor skills are compromised. You're not excluded. You're just in a stage-based situation to then come back, or maybe you transfer into another sport, but you're always included. And then those unique journeys can be honored. I'm going to be in Colorado Springs next week with the USOC, and I always find it interesting when I go down to the States, is they talk about a pipeline, the athlete pipeline. Where's Tony? And visualize a pipeline. A pipeline is a closed vehicle or transport system. You can't get in and out. You're in the pipeline and you go down the pipeline. As opposed to pathways where, as you can see in the rectangle, you're in and out and in a path. You may be in the national team junior program, which is the superhighway, but do you have a good secondary highway so that if you're off the superhighway, you're still moving down that pathway, as opposed to that closed unit of a pipeline? These concepts, to be able to communicate them to people that are not convinced that sport is wonderful, is important if you're going to include your whole society in the participation of sport and developing physical literacy. So again, in design of long-term development in sport and physical activity, we have the old model of designing around age as opposed to ability. And when we design around age, there's such differences within age that then it's very difficult to create developmentally appropriate training opportunities because we have such a range of ability. If we design around ability, always recognizing that the social emotional may not be consistent with the physical, nor be consistent with the technical tactical. So when you have ability and you have a great range of age and a great range of social emotional, then you have to address that as well. But if you can design around ability, you're going to have more meaningful competition and more developmentally appropriate training opportunities. So the stage-based rectangle, which is designed around ability, even though when you see information, you'll see a bit of a guide around ages, it's designed around ability so that you have a homogeneous group of participants, and then you can create developmentally appropriate training and competition. As opposed to the pyramid, which again you can see with the striated lines, is typically organized around age. And you would all understand in terms of the early onset of adolescence gives a huge advantage and a huge disadvantage to that early developer. So why do I say an early advantage and an early disadvantage? Because they often become bigger and stronger. So when they're bigger and stronger, they're more successful, so they don't get cut. They make it to the next level. But they make it to the next level based on strength and speed. And then they become dependent on strength and speed, whereas they're technical, tactical. They don't have to rely on technical, tactical. So therefore, they end up having a weakness in technical, tactical as they become equal in strength to the later developers. So if the later developers can be included in the same level of quality sport and experience later, because they've developed the technical tactical in terms to be successful, will actually outperform the early developer as long as they haven't been cut and being discarded and out of that superhighway of investment. Again, when we go to the triangle, the pyramid, it's based on cutting, where in the rectangle, it's based on transfer. if you're not good enough for a particular team, because we're honoring everyone's journey, then it's incumbent on the coach, on the system, on the club to move that participant into another situation, not to discard them, not to cut them and say, go find another sport. In this moment in time, you're not valued enough for us to invest in you. So again, the pyramid versus the rectangle. The athlete development models that were created in the 60s were all based and designed on being individual sport development approaches. They weren't integrated with other sports. Back in that time, I'm not sure about Sweden, but certainly I can talk about Canada. In the 50s and 60s, we wanted to design everything separate. So if you go into a community in Canada and you look at what was built, the schools were built and the recreation centers were built and the sport clubs were built, they were all built separate. So we'd have the school over here, and then over here there'd be a swimming pool and recreation center. The school was busy during the day, empty at night. Recreation center was empty in the day, busy at night. So now we see designers putting them together. It's just way more efficient. And we created systems back in the day that were separate systems. Now, in Europe, you're much better in terms of creating multi-sport clubs than in North America, where we have so many single sport clubs. And so we've created the pyramid where we worked alone. And now we're with the rectangle, and when you have the concept, that value of everyone involved, and we're valuing the journey, well, then we have to get people together. We have to get organizations together. And so we're doing a lot of work now with health, education, recreation, and sport at the table to say, hey, we're all involved in wanting a healthy, happy, successful child. So let's talk about that together. Let's not be independent. And we go into communities and we facilitate these partnership tables, and we're introducing people from one sector to another in their community. They're all working. They'll be all working with children, but they've actually never met each other because of the separate systems that have been designed and traditionally exist. So again, that concept, that valuing from a rectangle perspective. Again, when we look at the pyramid is designed for sport, whereas the rectangle is designed for society, for the greater global society, because we want healthy people on that journey. Again, some of them will be achieving gold medals, but we're looking at a healthy society. And as my colleague Istvan Bali would say, that medals are a byproduct of a healthy society. So we're really trying to move with the rectangle in terms of that society wellness perspective, as opposed to that single for individual sport perspective. Now, when I stand up and say things like I've just said, there'll be some people in the room that come from high performance sport, and they go, that's really nice, Richard. That's really nice. You're making it all health and wellness for society, and that's a good thing to do. Yeah, we're completely supportive of that, except for our athletes that we've talent ID'd over here. that this doesn't really apply to. You know, we've got our little group here, and thanks, but you know, you're doing great stuff. You know, a little pat on the head. You know, you're doing good stuff for sport, but we're serious about winning, and so we've got our athletes over here. So, in Canada, we've engaged with the 58 sports that are funded by Sport Canada. We've engaged with more sports that are not, and obviously some really engage. Some are especially in many cases high performance sport people. It's like we're still in the pyramid, you know, because don't waste my time with the athletes that aren't ready to go right now. And then other sports have saying, no, we get it. Like, we get it and we believe in it. So a few sports like Basketball Canada, when we engaged with them in the early 2000s, they got it right away in terms of okay, we want to move from preparing national teams and having a national coaching and certification program to where we're developing the game. We're going to represent Canada, and we're going to actually engage around the health of the nation. So basketball really engaged. Golf, they have an issue because the boomers are getting too old to walk around the golf course, and they're going to play pickleball. How many of you know pickleball? It's booming. Because the boomers are done with golf. So they really got into a junior program because they wanted to get more kids out. Tennis really got into a community program because what they saw, and when they got into the rectangle, they said, you know what, we're losing our tennis courts to soccer. And soccer players are taking over the tennis courts to play tennis soccer. We need to have a community program, and so they really invested in the community, got kids involved, because they recognized that, well, it's about for society. It's beyond that pyramid. So, how did those sports do from a performance perspective? Well, this is Brooke Henderson. And Brooke Henderson is 21 now, and she's one of the best in the world. And the Golf Canada, they say there's more coming. This is Canada basketball, and this is just on the men's side. They're doing very well on the women's side as well. And just to explain this, the red are the second round NBA draft picks. The blue are first round NBA draft picks. And you can see that between 1974, when the draft started, and 2009, I think it was 13 got drafted into the NBA. We started working with them in the early 2000s, and they did a tremendous job of reorganizing their system. They worked very hard, made tough decisions, and then it started to pay off 8 years later. And then you can see leading up to this year where there was 6 in one round drafted. So here they are. They shifted in the early 2000s from developing national team players to the health of the nation, developing the game. And the result is better high-performing athletes. Volleyball made tough decisions. Worked with them starting in December of 2004, came together and said, you know, we're struggling, we're low in the world rankings, we don't have anybody competing, and these are the world women's beach world champions. As of a month ago, the Canadian men's volleyball team is around 5th or 6th in the world. So again, moving to the rectangle actually helped performance when people that are in high performance are going, no, we've just got a talent ID, we've got to narrow the pyramid, and we got to get rid of the athletes that don't make it. And then, do you recognize any athlete there? Serena, right? What about the other girl? Does anybody recognize her? Yeah, that's Bianca. Bianca's 19. And as we would say, she's an LT80 baby. And she just won the US Open and the Canadian Open, beating Serena. Serena bowed out in the Canadian one. And then has just last weekend won the US Open. She's 19. But now hold on, Richard. Hold on. Let's not get too excited here. Whoa. She's an outlier. You're telling me outliers. Well, there's Chapo. He's 20, I think, 20 or 21. He's in 1999. There's Felix. And there's Fernandez. She's the #1 ranked junior in the world. So now it's not an outlier, because always be wary of the outliers. But this is system. This is a system change. So they change their system based on the rectangle, and now they have performance. And they're the best in the world, becoming the best in the world. She's up to #5. So what I'm saying there is that when you go out and you say, hey, I'm on the rectangle bandwagon, you're going to run into people who, no, we're about high performance. It's about the pyramid. We've got to get rid of them. Because we're about performance, that's what's important to us. It's not true. The rectangle can do both. It can include and honor people on a journey. And it can also create the performance that often government or people want to fund. So that's the story of the triangle versus the rectangle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
We maybe have time for one question.
Oh.
Richard wasn't expecting that. I like to catch him off guard.
No.
Pretty much daily in the office, whenever we're actually in the office together, I try and just throw little curveballs at him. So anyone want to ask Richard one question?
Or you can ask Bjorn as well.
We have a question up there. Okay, I'm going to be the mic runner.
Thank you for your presentation, giving lots of inspiration. And as you know, we work with this long-term athlete development model in many sports associations in Sweden as well. But when you gave those last examples, there was something that happened in my head as we try to work to make the athletes or the participants to perform later in terms of participating in big international competitions, avoid them to participate too early, and to keep them on longer so that they will not, get burned out. And then you showed the examples with those quite young, good performers. And how would you relate that? Please comment.
Right. So with each sport, the timing of specialization is unique. When we say quite young, that's still a 19-year-old, right? Tennis, as you know, historically has had early performers at a very high level on the women's side, 15, 16-year-olds. I think Jennifer Capriati, she was even maybe 14 when she went to the U.S. Open. So in terms of timing for tennis, that's an appropriate development timing to be able to come into and be competitive internationally around that 19, 20 years old, right? So it varies based on sport. And then, of course, it varies a little bit based on the individual, but often we do have to slow down the athlete. In individual sports, it's a little bit easier because you can have the basically 2 wins, 1 loss, right? If they're in tennis, 2 wins, 1 loss is developmentally appropriate. That's a very rough measure, right? And then if the parent is pushing to say, well, I want them to go to a higher level competition because my ego wants them to be in that competition. Well, if they're not 2 wins, 1 loss, then they're not in a developmentally appropriate situation, right? And then when that happens, especially in a sport like tennis, then your athlete's not taking risk, they're not developing creativity, and so it's always that measuring of, are they in that developmentally appropriate situation where they're learning the skills that are appropriate at that stage of development. It always comes back to the skills at that stage of development. So that's the monitoring. Does it make sense?
Okay, feel free to nab Richard for other questions over the remainder of the conference. Thanks again, Richard.
You're welcome.